John Fitzgerald Jack Kennedy, commonly referred to by his initials JFK, was an American politician who served as the 35th President of the United States from January 1961 until his assassination in November 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the establishment of the Peace Corps, developments in the space race, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Trade Expansion Act to lower tariffs, and the Civil Rights Movement all took place during his presidency. Kennedy was a member of the Democratic Party, and his New Frontier domestic program was largely enacted as a memorial to him after his death. Kennedy also established the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1963. Kennedy's time in office was marked by high tensions with communist states. He increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam by a factor of 18 over President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In Cuba, a failed attempt was made at the Bay of Pigs to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro in April 1961. He subsequently rejected plans by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to orchestrate false flag attacks on American soil in order to gain public approval for a war against Cuba. In October 1962, it was discovered Soviet ballistic missiles had been deployed in Cuba. The resulting period of unease, termed the Cuban Missile Crisis, is seen by many historians as the closest the human race has ever come to nuclear war between nuclear-armed belligerents. After military service in the United States Naval Reserve in World War II, Kennedy represented Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1947 to 1953. He was elected subsequently to the U.S. Senate and served as the junior senator for Massachusetts from 1953 until 1960. Kennedy defeated Vice President and Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon in the 1960 U.S. presidential election. At age 43, he became the youngest elected president and the second youngest president, after Theodore Roosevelt, who was 42 when he became president after the assassination of William McKinley. Kennedy was also the first person born in the 20th century to serve as president. To date, Kennedy has been the only Roman Catholic president and the only president to have won a Pulitzer Prize for his biography, Profiles in Courage. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested that afternoon and determined to have fired the shots that hit the president from a sixth-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby fatally shot Oswald 2 days later in a jail corridor. Then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson succeeded Kennedy after he died in the hospital. The FBI and the Warren Commission officially concluded that Oswald was the lone assassin, but its report was sharply criticized. The United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, agreed that Oswald fired the shots that killed the president, but also concluded that Kennedy was likely assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. The majority of Americans alive at the time of the assassination, and continuing through 2013, believed that there was a conspiracy and that Oswald was not the only shooter. Since the 1960s, information concerning Kennedy's private life has come to light, including his health problems and allegations of infidelity. Kennedy continues to rank highly in historians' polls of U.S. presidents and with a general public. His average approval rating of 70% is the highest of any president in Gallup's history of systematically measuring job approval. Early life and education. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, on May 29, 1917. Kennedy had an elder brother, Joseph Jr., and 7 younger siblings: Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Ted. Kennedy lived in Brookline for 10 years and attended the Edward Devotion School, the Noble and Greenough Lower School, and the Dexter School through 4th grade. In 1927, the Kennedy family moved to a stately 20-room, Georgian-style mansion at 5040 Independence Avenue, across the street from Wave Hill, in the Hudson Hill neighborhood of Riverdale, Bronx, New York City. He attended the lower campus of Riverdale Country School, a private school for boys, from 5th to 7th grade. 2 years later, the family moved to 294 Penfield Road in the New York City suburb of Bronxville, New York, where Kennedy was a member of Boy Scout Troop 2. The Kennedy family at Hyannisport, Massachusetts. In 1931, with jacket top left and white shirt, Ted was born the following year. In September 1931, Kennedy attended Choate, a boarding school in Wallingford, Connecticut, for 9th through 12th grade. His older brother had already been at Choate for 2 years and was a football player and leading student. He spent his first years at Choate in his older brother's shadow, and compensated for this with rebellious behavior which attracted a coterie. Their most notorious stunt was to explode a toilet seat with a powerful firecracker. In the ensuing chapel assembly, the strict headmaster, George Street, John, brandished the toilet seat and spoke of certain muckers who would spit in our sea. The defiant Kennedy took the cue and named his group the Muckers Club, which included roommate and friend Kirk Lemoyne Billings. During his Choate years, Kennedy was beset by health problems that culminated with his emergency hospitalization at New Haven Hospital in 1934, where doctors thought he might have had leukemia. In September 1935, he made his first trip abroad with his parents and his sister Kathleen to London, intending to study under Harold Laski at the London School of Economics, LSE, as his older brother had done. Ill health forced his return to America in October of that year, when he enrolled late and spent 6 weeks at Princeton University. In 1935, Kennedy briefly attended Princeton University, but had to leave after 2 months due to a gastrointestinal illness. Later, in September 1936, Kennedy enrolled at Harvard College, and his application essay stated, "The reasons that I have for wishing to go to Harvard are several. I feel that Harvard can give me a better background and a better liberal education than any other university. I have always wanted to go there, as I have felt that it is not just another college, but is a university with something definite to offer. Then too, I would like to go to the same college as my father. To be a Harvard man is an enviable distinction, and one that I sincerely hope I shall attain." Quote. In 1939, Kennedy toured Europe, the Soviet Union, the Balkans, and the Middle East in preparation for his Harvard senior honors thesis. He then went to Czechoslovakia and Germany before returning to London on September 1, 1939, the day that Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, the family was in the House of Commons for speeches endorsing the United Kingdom's declaration of war on Germany. Kennedy was sent as his father's representative to help with arrangements for American survivors of the SS Athenia before flying back to the U.S. from Foynes, Ireland, to Port Washington, New York on his first transatlantic flight. As an upperclassman at Harvard, Kennedy became a more serious student and developed an interest in political philosophy. In his junior year, he made the Dean's List. U.S. Navy Reserve. Kennedy attempted to enter the Army's officer candidate school in 1940, but was medically disqualified for his chronic lower back problems. On September 24, 1941, after exercising for months to strengthen his back, and with the help of the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, former naval attaché to Joseph Kennedy, he joined the United States Naval Reserve, U.S. Navy Reserve since 2005. He was commissioned an ensign on October 26, 1941. In January 1942, Kennedy was assigned to the Oney Field Office at Headquarters, 6th Naval District, in Charleston, South Carolina. His first command was PT 101 from December 7, 1942, until February 23, 1943. PT 109 and PT 59. In April 1943, he was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron 2. On September 1, 1943, Kennedy returned to duty and took command of a PT boat converted into a gunboat, the PT 59. Kennedy was in Chelsea Naval Hospital from May to December 1944. On August 12, 1944, his older brother, Joe Jr., a Navy pilot, was killed after volunteering for a special and hazardous air mission when his explosive-laden plane exploded over the English Channel. On March 1, 1945, Kennedy was retired from the Navy Reserve on physical disability and honorably discharged with the full rank of lieutenant. Military awards. Kennedy's military decorations and awards include the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, Purple Heart Medal, American Defense Service Medal, American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 3.3.16 Bronze Stars, and the World War II Victory Medal. Post-naval service. In April 1945, Kennedy's father, who was a friend of William Randolph Hearst, arranged a position for his son as a special correspondent for Hearst newspapers. The assignment kept Kennedy's name in the public eye and exposed congressional career. Because his eldest brother had been the family's political standard-bearer, and had been tapped by his father to seek the presidency, his death in 1944 changed that course, and the task now fell to the younger Kennedy. U.S. House of Representatives. At the urging of Kennedy's father, U.S. Representative James Michael Curley vacated his seat in the strongly Democratic 11th Congressional District in Massachusetts to become mayor of Boston in 1946. Kennedy ran for the seat, beating his Republican opponent by a large margin in November 1946. He served as a congressman for 6 years. U.S. Senate. Kennedy nominating Adlai Stevenson for the presidential nomination at the 1952 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. After serving 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, Kennedy decided to run for a seat in the U.S. Senate representing Massachusetts against incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. His mother and sisters held Kennedy teas throughout the state, and his younger brother Robert managed his campaign. In the presidential election, General Dwight D. Eisenhower carried Massachusetts by a margin of 208,000 votes, but Kennedy defeated Lodge by 70,000 votes for the Senate seat. Kennedy underwent several spinal operations over the next 2 years, often absent from the Senate. He was at times critically ill and received Catholic last rites. During his convalescence in 1956, he published Profiles in Courage, a book about U.S. senators who risked their careers for their personal beliefs, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1957. At the 1956 Democratic National Convention, presidential nominee Adlai Stevenson let the convention select the vice presidential nominee. Kennedy finished second in the balloting, losing to Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee but receiving national exposure as a result. One of the matters demanding Kennedy's attention in the Senate was President Eisenhower's bill for the Civil Rights Act of 1957. In 1958, Kennedy was re-elected to a second term in the Senate, defeating his Republican opponent, Boston lawyer Vincent J. Celeste, by a wide margin of 874 608 votes, the largest ever in Massachusetts politics. While Kennedy's father was a strong supporter of Senator Joseph McCarthy, McCarthy was also a friend of the Kennedy family. As well, Bobby Kennedy worked for McCarthy's subcommittee, and McCarthy dated Kennedy's sister Patricia. In 1954, the Senate voted to censure McCarthy and Kennedy drafted a speech supporting the censure. However, it was not delivered because Kennedy was hospitalized at the time. The speech had the potential of putting Kennedy in the position of participating procedurally by pairing his vote against that of another senator. Although Kennedy never indicated how he would have voted, the episode damaged his support among members of the liberal community, including Eleanor Roosevelt, in the 1956 and 1960 elections. 1960 presidential election. Main articles: Democratic Party, United States, presidential primaries, 1960 and United States presidential election, 1960. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon participate in the first televised presidential debate in Washington, D.C. in 1960. On January 2, 1960, Kennedy initiated his campaign for president in the Democratic primary election, where he faced challenges from Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota and Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon. Kennedy defeated Humphrey in Wisconsin and West Virginia, Morse in Maryland and Oregon, as well as token opposition, often write-in candidates, in New Hampshire, Indiana, and Nebraska. Kennedy visited a coal mine in West Virginia. Most miners and others in that predominantly conservative Protestant state were quite wary of Kennedy's Roman Catholicism. His victory in West Virginia confirmed his broad popular appeal. At the Democratic Convention, he gave his well-known New Frontier speech, saying, "For the problems are not all solved and the battles are not all won, and we stand today on the edge of a new frontier. But the new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer the American people, but what I intend to ask of them." Quote. With Humphrey and Morse eliminated, Kennedy's main opponent at the Los Angeles Convention was Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. Kennedy overcame this formal challenge, as well as informal ones from Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee in 1952 and 1956, Stuart Symington, and several favorite sons. And on July 13, the Democratic Convention nominated Kennedy as its candidate. Kennedy asked Johnson to be his vice presidential candidate, despite opposition from many liberal delegates and Kennedy's own staff, including his brother Bobby. Kennedy needed Johnson's strength in the South to win what was considered likely to be the closest election since 1916. Major issues included how to get the economy moving again, Kennedy's Roman Catholicism, Cuba, and whether the Soviet space and missile programs had surpassed those of the U.S. To address fears that his being Catholic would impact his decision-making, he famously told the Greater Houston Ministerial Association on September 12, 1960, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party candidate for president who also happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." Quote. Outgoing President Dwight D. Eisenhower meets with President-elect John F. Kennedy on December 6, 1960. In September and October, Kennedy appeared with Vice President and Republican candidate Richard Nixon in the first televised U.S. presidential debates in U.S. history. During these programs, Nixon, with a sore, injured leg and his 5 o'clock shadow, was perspiring and looked tense and uncomfortable, while Kennedy, choosing to avail himself of makeup services, appeared relaxed, leading the huge television audience to favor him as the winner. Radio listeners either thought that Nixon had won or that the debates were a draw. Kennedy's campaign gained momentum after the first debate, and he pulled slightly ahead of Nixon in most polls. On November 8, Kennedy defeated Nixon in one of the closest presidential elections of the 20th century. In the national popular vote, by most accounts, Kennedy led Nixon by just 0.2%, while in the Electoral College, he won 303 votes to Nixon's 219. 14 electors from Mississippi and Alabama refused to support Kennedy because of his support for the civil rights movement. They voted for Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia, as did an elector from Oklahoma. Presidency. John F. Kennedy takes the presidential oath of office administered by Chief Justice Earl Warren on January 20, 1961, at the Capitol. John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th president at noon on January 20, 1961. In his inaugural address he spoke of the need for all Americans to be active citizens, famously saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." Quote, he asked the nations of the world to join together to fight what he called the common enemies of man: tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Quote, all this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin. Quote, in closing, he expanded on his desire for greater internationalism. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. The address reflected Kennedy's confidence that his administration would chart an historically significant course in both domestic policy and foreign affairs. The contrast between this optimistic vision and the pressures of managing daily political realities at home and abroad would be one of the main tensions running through the early years of his administration. John F. Kennedy speaking at Rice University in Houston on September 12, 1962. Lyndon Johnson can be seen behind him. Kennedy brought to the White House a contrast in organization compared to the decision-making structure of former General Eisenhower, and he wasted no time in scrapping Eisenhower's methods. Much to the chagrin of his economic advisors who wanted him to reduce taxes, Kennedy quickly agreed to a balanced budget pledge. This was needed in exchange for votes to expand the membership of the House Rules Committee in order to give the Democrats a majority in setting the legislative agenda. Kennedy approved Defense Secretary Robert McNamara's controversial decision to award the contract for the F-111 TFX tactical fighter experimental fighter bomber to General Dynamics, the choice of the Civilian Defense Department, over Boeing, the choice of the military. During the summer of 1962, Kennedy had a secret taping system set up in the White House, most likely to aid his future memoir. It recorded many conversations with Kennedy and his cabinet members, including those in relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Foreign policy. President Kennedy's foreign policy was dominated by American confrontations with the Soviet Union, manifested by proxy contests in the early stage of the Cold War. In 1961, Kennedy anxiously anticipated a summit with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. He started off on the wrong foot by reacting aggressively to a routine Khrushchev speech on Cold War confrontation in early 1961. The speech was intended for domestic audiences in the Soviet Union, but Kennedy interpreted it as a personal challenge. His mistake helped raise tensions going into the Vienna summit of June 1961. On the way to the summit, Kennedy stopped in Paris to meet Charles de Gaulle, who advised him to ignore Khrushchev's abrasive style. The French president feared the United States' presumed influence in Europe. Nevertheless, de Gaulle was quite impressed with the young president and his family. Kennedy picked up on this in his speech in Paris, saying that he would be remembered as the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris. Quote, on June 4, 1961, the president met with Khrushchev in Vienna and left the meetings angry and disappointed that he had allowed the premier to bully him, despite the warnings he had received. Khrushchev, for his part, was impressed with the president's intelligence, but thought him weak. Kennedy did succeed in conveying the bottom line to Khrushchev on the most sensitive issue before them, a proposed treaty between Moscow and East Berlin. He made it clear that any such treaty which interfered with U.S. access rights in West Berlin would be regarded as an act of war. Shortly after the president returned home, the USSR announced its intention to sign a treaty with East Berlin, abrogating any third-party occupation rights in either sector of the city. Kennedy, depressed and angry, assumed that his only option was to prepare the country for nuclear war, which he personally thought had a 1 in 5 chance of occurring. In the weeks immediately after the Vienna summit, more than 20,000 people fled from East Berlin to the western sector in reaction to statements from the USSR. Kennedy began intensive meetings on the Berlin issue, where Dean Acheson took the lead in recommending a military buildup alongside NATO allies. The following month, the Soviet Union and East Berlin began blocking any further passage of East Berliners into West Berlin and erected barbed wire fences across the city, which were quickly upgraded to the Berlin Wall. Kennedy's initial reaction was to ignore this, as long as free access from West to East Berlin continued. This course was altered when it was learned that West Berliners had lost confidence in the defense of their position by the United States. Kennedy sent Vice President Johnson, along with a host of military personnel, in convoy through West Germany, including Soviet armed checkpoints, to demonstrate the continued commitment of the U.S. to West Berlin. Kennedy gave a speech at St. Anselm College on May 5, 1960, regarding America's conduct in the emerging Cold War. The address detailed how American foreign policy should be conducted towards African nations, noting a hint of support for modern African nationalism by saying that, "For we, too, founded a new nation on revolt from colonial rule." Quote, Cuba and the Bay of Pigs invasion. The prior Eisenhower administration had created a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. The plan, led by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, with help from the U.S. military, was for an invasion of Cuba by a counter-revolutionary insurgency composed of U.S. trained, anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Kennedy approved the final invasion plan on April 4, 1961. On April 17, 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion began. 500 U.S. trained Cubans, called Brigade 2506, landed on the island. No U.S. air support was provided. Allen Dulles, director of the CIA, later stated that they thought the president would authorize any action required for success once the troops were on the ground. By April 19, 1961, the Cuban government had captured or killed the invading exiles, and Kennedy was forced to negotiate for the release of the 189 survivors. After 20 months, Cuba released the captured exiles in exchange for $53 million worth of food and medicine. According to biographer Richard Reeves, Kennedy focused primarily on the political repercussions of the plan rather than military considerations. When it failed, he was convinced that the plan was a setup to make him look bad. In late 1961, the White House formed the Special Group, headed by Robert Kennedy and including Edward Lansdale, Secretary Robert McNamara, and others. The group's objective, to overthrow Castro via espionage, sabotage, and other covert tactics, was never pursued. Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 14, 1962, CIA U-2 spy planes took photographs of intermediate-range ballistic missile sites being built in Cuba by the Soviets. The photos were shown to Kennedy on October 16. A consensus was reached that the missiles were offensive in nature and thus posed an immediate nuclear threat. Kennedy faced a dilemma. If the U.S. attacked the sites, it might lead to nuclear war with the USSR. But if the U.S. did nothing, it would be faced with the increased threat from close-range nuclear weapons. The U.S. would also appear to the world as less committed to the defense of the hemisphere. On a personal level, Kennedy needed to show resolve in reaction to Khrushchev, especially after the Vienna summit. More than a third of the members of the National Security Council, NSC, favored an unannounced air assault on the missile sites. But for some of them this conjured up an image of Pearl Harbor in reverse. The U.S. Navy would stop and inspect all Soviet ships arriving off Cuba. Beginning October 24, the Organization of American States gave unanimous support to the removal of the missiles. The president exchanged 2 sets of letters with Khrushchev, to no avail. One Soviet-flagged ship was stopped and boarded. On October 28, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missile sites, subject to UN inspections. This crisis brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. In the end, the humanity of the 2 men prevailed. Latin America and communism. President John F. Kennedy with Chilean President Jorge Alessandri on an official visit in December 1962, arguing that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Quote, he worked closely with the governor of Puerto Rico Luis Muñoz Marin for the development of the Alliance of Progress, and began working towards the autonomy of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. When the president took office, the Eisenhower administration, through the CIA, had begun formulating plans for the assassination of Castro in Cuba and Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Kennedy privately instructed the CIA that any such planning must include plausible deniability by the U.S. His public position was in opposition. Peace Corps. As one of his first presidential acts, Kennedy asked Congress to create the Peace Corps. His brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, was its first director. Southeast Asia. Main articles: Laotian Civil War, 1963 South Vietnamese coup, arrest and assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, reaction to the 1963 South Vietnamese coup, Cable 243, Buddhist crisis, Thich Quang Th. C. X. L. Pagoda raids, Krulik Mendenhall mission, and McNamara-Taylor mission. When briefing Kennedy, Eisenhower emphasized that the communist threat in Southeast Asia required priority. Eisenhower considered Laos to be the cork in the bottle in regards to the regional threat. In March 1961, Kennedy voiced a change in policy from supporting a free Laos to a neutral Laos, indicating privately that Vietnam, and not Laos, should be deemed America's tripwire for communism's spread in the area. In May 1961 he dispatched Lyndon Johnson to meet with South Vietnam's President Ngo Dinh Diem. Johnson assured Diem more aid to mold the fighting force that could resist the communists. During his administration, Kennedy continued policies that provided political and economic support, and military advice and support, to the South Vietnamese government. In late 1961, President Kennedy sent Roger Hilsman, then director of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, to assess the situation in Vietnam. There, Hilsman met Sir Robert Thompson, head of the British advisory mission to South Vietnam, in the concept of the strategic hamlet. program was formed. It was approved by Kennedy and South Vietnam President Ngo Dinh Diem. It was implemented in early 1962 and involved some forced relocation, village internment, and segregation of rural South Vietnamese into new communities where the peasantry would be isolated from communist insurgents. It was hoped that these new communities would provide security for the peasants and strengthen the tie between them and the central government. By November 1963, the program waned and officially ended in 1964. In early 1962, Kennedy formally authorized escalated involvement when he signed the National Security Action Memorandum, Subversive Insurgency, War of Liberation, quote. In April 1963, Kennedy assessed the situation in Vietnam. "We don't have a prayer of staying in Vietnam. Those people hate us. They are going to throw our asses out of there at any point. But I can't give up that territory to the communists and get the American people to re-elect me." Kennedy faced a crisis in Vietnam by July. Despite increased U.S. support, the South Vietnamese military was only marginally effective against pro-communist Viet Cong forces. On August 21, just as the new U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. arrived, Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu ordered South Vietnam forces, funded and trained by the CIA, to quell Buddhist demonstrations. The crackdowns heightened expectations of a coup d'etat to remove Diem with, or perhaps by, his brother, Nhu. Cable 243. DEPTL 243. Dated August 24. Followed, declaring Washington would no longer tolerate Nhu's actions, and Lodge was ordered to pressure Diem to remove Nhu. If Diem refused, the Americans would explore alternative leadership. At week's end, Kennedy learned from Lodge that the Diem government might, due to France's assistance to Nhu, be dealing secretly with the communists, and might ask the Americans to leave. Orders were sent to Saigon and throughout Washington to destroy all coup cables. A White House meeting in September was indicative of the very different ongoing appraisals. The president was given updated assessments after personal inspections on the ground by the Department of Defense, General Victor Krulak, and the State Department, Joseph Mendenhall. Krulak said that the military fight against the communists was progressing and being won, while Mendenhall stated that the country was civilly being lost to any EU.'s influence. Kennedy reacted, saying, "Did you two gentlemen visit the same country?" The president was unaware that the two men were at such odds that they had not spoken to each other on the return flight. In October 1963, the president appointed Defense Secretary McNamara and General Maxwell D. Taylor to a Vietnam mission in another effort to synchronize the information and formulation of policy. The objective of the McNamara-Taylor mission emphasized the importance of getting to the bottom of the differences in reporting from U.S. representatives in Vietnam. Quote, Taylor and McNamara were also enlightened by Vietnam's Vice President Win Ngoc Tho, choice of many to succeed Diem should a coup occur, who in detailed terms obliterated Taylor's information that the military was succeeding in the countryside. In late October, intelligence wires again reported that a coup against the Diem government was afoot. The source, Vietnamese General Duong Van Minh, also known as Big Minh, wanted to know the U.S. position. Kennedy instructed Lodge to offer covert assistance to the coup, excluding assassination, and to ensure deniability by the U.S. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals, led by Big Minh, overthrew the Diem government, arresting and then killing Diem and Nhu. Kennedy was shocked by the deaths. He found out afterwards that Minh had asked the CIA field office to secure safe passage out of the country for Diem and Nhu, but was told that 24 hours were needed to procure a plane. Min responded that he could not hold them that long. News of the coup led to renewed confidence initially, both in America and in South Vietnam, that the war might be won. Historians disagree on whether Vietnam would have escalated had Kennedy survived and been re-elected in 1964. When Robert Kennedy was asked in 1964 what his brother would have done if the South Vietnamese had been on the brink of defeat, he replied, "We'd face that when we came to it." Quote. American University speech. To discuss a topic on which too often ignorance abounds and the truth is too rarely perceived, yet it is the most important topic on earth. World peace. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. In an age when a singular nuclear weapon contains 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied forces in the Second World War. An age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and air and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. And man can be as big as he wants. The president also made 2 announcements: that the Soviets had expressed a desire to negotiate a nuclear test ban treaty, and that the U.S. had postponed planned atmospheric tests. West Berlin speech. Ich bin ein Berliner speech from the Rathaus Schönberg by John F. Kennedy, June 26, 1963. Duration 9:01. In 1963, Germany was enduring a time of particular vulnerability due to Soviet aggression to the east, and the impending retirement of West German Chancellor Adenauer. On June 26, President Kennedy gave a public speech in West Berlin reiterating the American commitment to Germany and criticizing communism. He was met with an ecstatic response from a massive audience. Israel. In 1960, Kennedy stated, "Israel will endure and flourish. It is the child of hope and the home of the brave. It can neither be broken by adversity nor demoralized by success. It carries the shield of democracy and it honors the sword of freedom." Quote. Subsequently, as president, Kennedy initiated the creation of security ties with Israel, and he is credited as the founder of the U.S.-Israeli military alliance, which would be continued under subsequent presidents. Kennedy ended the arms embargo that the Eisenhower and Truman administrations had enforced on Israel, describing the protection of Israel as a moral and national commitment. He was the first to introduce the concept of a special relationship, as he described it to Golda Meir, between the U.S. and Israel. Kennedy extended the first informal security guarantees to Israel in 1962 and, beginning in 1963, was the first U.S. president to allow the sale to Israel of advanced U.S. weaponry, the MiM-23 Hawk, as well as to provide diplomatic support for Israeli policies which were opposed by Arab neighbors, such as its water project on the Jordan River. As a result of this newly created security alliance, Kennedy also encountered tensions with the Israeli government over the production of nuclear materials in ammonia, which he believed could instigate a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. After the existence of a nuclear plant was initially denied by the Israeli government, David Ben-Gurion stated in a speech to the Israeli Knesset on December 21, 1960, that the purpose of the nuclear plant at Beersheba was for research in problems of arid zones and desert flora and fauna. Quote. When Kennedy wrote that, he was skeptical and stated, in a May 1963 letter to Ben-Gurion, that American support to Israel could be in jeopardy if reliable information on the Israeli nuclear program was not forthcoming. Ben-Gurion repeated previous reassurances that Dimona was being developed for peaceful purposes. The Israeli government resisted American pressure to open its nuclear facilities to International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) inspections. In 1962, the U.S. and Israeli governments had agreed to an annual inspection regime. A science attaché at the embassy in Tel Aviv concluded that parts of the Dimona facility had been shut down temporarily to mislead American scientists when they visited. According to Seymour Hersh, the Israelis set up false control rooms to show the Americans. Israeli lobbyist Abe Feinberg stated, "It was part of my job to tip them off that Kennedy was insisting on." Roger Davies, the director of the State Department's Office of Near Eastern Affairs, concluded in March 1965 that Israel was developing nuclear weapons. He reported that Israel's target date for achieving nuclear capability was 1968. 1969. Iraq. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shah of Iran, Kennedy, and U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara in the White House Cabinet Room on April 13, 1962. Relations between the United States and Iraq became strained following the overthrow of the Iraqi monarchy on July 14, 1958, which resulted in the declaration of a Republican government led by Brigadier Abd al-Karim Qasem. In December 1961, Qassem's government passed Public Law 80, which restricted the British and American-owned Iraq Petroleum Company (IPC's) concessionary holding to those areas in which oil was actually being produced, effectively expropriating 99.5% of the IPC concession. U.S. officials were alarmed by the expropriation as well as the recent Soviet veto of an Egyptian-sponsored UN resolution requesting the admittance of Kuwait as UN member state, which they believed to be connected. Senior National Security Council advisor Robert Comer worried that if the IPC ceased production in response, Qasem might grab Kuwait, thus achieving a stranglehold on Middle Eastern oil production, or throw himself into Russian arms. Comer also made note of widespread rumors that a nationalist coup against Qasem could be imminent, and had the potential to get Iraq back on. In April 1962, the State Department issued new guidelines on Iraq that were intended to increase American influence there. Meanwhile, Kennedy instructed the CIA, under the direction of Archibald Bullock Roosevelt Jr., to begin making preparations for a military coup against Qasem. The anti-imperialist and anti-communist Iraqi Ba'ath Party overthrew and executed Qasem in a violent coup on February 8, 1963. While there have been persistent rumors that the CIA orchestrated the coup, declassified documents and the testimony of former CIA officers indicate that there was no direct American involvement, although the CIA was actively seeking a suitable replacement for Qasem within the Iraqi military, and had been informed of an earlier Ba'athist coup plot. Ireland. During his 4-day visit to his ancestral home of Ireland in June 1963, he also became the first foreign leader to address the Houses of the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament. Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Troubled by the long-term dangers of radioactive contamination and nuclear weapons proliferation, Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to negotiate a nuclear test ban treaty, originally conceived in Adlai Stevenson's 1956 presidential campaign. In July 1963, Kennedy sent W. Averell Harriman to Moscow to negotiate a treaty with the Soviets. Ultimately, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union were the initial signatories to a limited treaty, which prohibited atomic testing on the ground, in the atmosphere, or underwater, but not underground. The U.S. Senate ratified this and Kennedy signed it into law in October 1963. France was quick to declare that it was free to continue developing and testing its nuclear defenses. Domestic policy. Kennedy called his domestic program the New Frontier. It ambitiously promised federal funding for education, medical care for the elderly, economic aid to rural regions, and government intervention to halt the recession. Kennedy also promised an end to racial discrimination. In his 1963 State of the Union address, he proposed substantial tax reform and a reduction in income tax rates from the current range of 20–90% to a range of 14–65%. He proposed a reduction in the corporate tax rates from 52 to 47%. Kennedy added that the top rate should be set at 70% if certain deductions were not eliminated for high-income earners. To the Economic Club of New York, he spoke in 1963 of the paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high and revenues too low, and the soundest way to raise revenue in the long term is to lower rates now. Quote, economy. Kennedy ended a period of tight fiscal policies, loosening monetary policy to keep interest rates down and to encourage growth of the economy. The economy turned around and prospered during the Kennedy administration. GDP expanded by an average of 5% from early 1961 to late 1963. Robert Kennedy took the position that the steel executives had illegally colluded to fix prices. He stated, "We're going for broke. Their expense accounts, where they've been and what they've been doing. The FBI is to interview them all. We can't lose this." Quote, the administration's actions influenced U.S. Steel to rescind the price increase. A New York Times editorial praised Kennedy's actions and said that the steel industry's price increase imperils the economic welfare of the country by inviting a tidal wave of inflation. Quote, federal and military death penalty. As president, Kennedy oversaw the last federal execution prior to Furman v. Georgia, a 1972 case that led to a moratorium on federal executions. On March 22, 1962, Kennedy signed into law H.R. 5143, PL 87-423, abolishing the mandatory death penalty for first-degree murder in the District of Columbia, the only remaining jurisdiction in the United States with such a penalty. Civil rights. The turbulent end of state-sanctioned racial discrimination was one of the most pressing domestic issues of the 1960s. Jim Crow segregation was the established law in the Deep South. Kennedy verbally supported racial integration and civil rights. During the 1960 campaign he telephoned Coretta Scott King, wife of the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., who had been jailed while trying to integrate a department store lunch counter. Robert Kennedy called Georgia Governor Ernest Vandiver and obtained King's release from prison, which drew additional black support to his brother's candidacy. In his first State of the Union address in January 1961, President Kennedy said, "The denial of constitutional rights to some of our fellow Americans on account of race, at the ballot box and elsewhere, disturbs the national conscience, and subjects us to the charge of world opinion that our democracy is not equal to the high promise of our heritage." Quote, Kennedy was concerned with other issues early in his presidency, such as the Cold War, Bay of Pigs fiasco and the situation in Southeast Asia. As articulated by Brother Robert, the administration's early priority was to keep the president out of this civil rights mess. Civil rights movement participants, mainly those on the front line in the South, viewed Kennedy as lukewarm. On March 6, 1961, Kennedy signed Executive Order 10,925, which required government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment, without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. Quote, in September 1962, James Meredith enrolled at the University of Mississippi but was prevented from entering. Attorney General Robert Kennedy responded by sending 400 federal marshals, while President Kennedy reluctantly sent 3,000 troops after the situation on campus turned violent. In early 1963, Kennedy related to Martin Luther King, Jr., his thoughts on the prospects for civil rights legislation. If we get into a long fight over this in Congress, it will bottleneck everything else, and we will still get no bill. Quote, on June 11, 1963, President Kennedy intervened when Alabama Governor George Wallace blocked the doorway to the University of Alabama to stop two African American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from attending. Wallace moved aside only after being confronted by Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach and the Alabama National Guard, which had just been federalized by order of the president. That evening, Kennedy gave his famous civil rights address on national television and radio, launching his initiative for civil rights legislation to provide equal access to public schools and other facilities, and greater protection of voting rights. His proposals became part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The day ended with the murder of NAACP leader Medgar Evers in front of his home in Mississippi. Earlier, Kennedy had signed the executive order creating the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. On December 14, 1961, over 100,000, predominantly African Americans, gathered in Washington for the Civil Rights March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963. Kennedy feared the march would have a negative effect on the prospects for the civil rights bills in Congress, and declined an invitation to speak. He turned over some of the details of the government's involvement to the Department of Justice, which channeled hundreds of thousands of dollars to the 6 sponsors of the march, including the NAACP and Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. To ensure a peaceful demonstration, the organizers and the president personally edited speeches which were inflammatory and agreed the march would be held on a Wednesday and would be over at 4:00 p.m. Thousands of troops were placed on standby. Kennedy watched King's speech on TV and was very impressed. The march was considered a triumph of managed protest, and not one arrest relating to the demonstration occurred. Afterwards, the march leaders accepted an invitation to the White House to meet with Kennedy and photos were taken. Kennedy felt that the march was a victory for him as well and bolstered the chance for his civil rights bill. Nevertheless, the struggle was far from over. 3 weeks later, a bomb exploded on Sunday, September 15 at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. By the end of the day, 4 African American children had died in the explosion, and 2 other children shot to death in the aftermath. Civil liberties. In 1963, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who hated civil rights leader Martin Luther King, Jr., and viewed him as an upstart troublemaker. Although Kennedy only gave written approval for limited wiretapping of King's phones on a trial basis for a month or so. Immigration. John F. Kennedy initially proposed an overhaul of American immigration policy that was later to become the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, sponsored by his brother Senator Edward Kennedy. It dramatically shifted the source of immigration from Northern and Western European countries towards immigration from Latin America and Asia. The policy change also shifted the emphasis in the selection of immigrants in favor of family reunification. Native American relations. Construction of the Kinzua Dam flooded 10,000 acres of Seneca Nation land that they had occupied under the Treaty of 1794, and forced 600 Seneca to relocate to Salamanca, New York. Kennedy was asked by the American Civil Liberties Union to intervene and to halt the project, but he declined, citing a critical need for flood control. He expressed concern about the plight of the Seneca, and directed government agencies to assist in obtaining more land, damages, and assistance to help mitigate their displacement. Space policy. The Apollo program was conceived early in 1960, during the Eisenhower administration, as a follow-up to Project Mercury, to be used as a shuttle to an Earth orbital space station, flights around the Moon, or landing on it, while NASA went ahead with planning for Apollo. Funding for the program was far from certain, given Eisenhower's ambivalent attitude to manned spaceflight. In constructing his presidential administration, Kennedy elected to retain Eisenhower's last science advisor Jerome Wiesner as head of the President's Science Advisory Committee. Wiesner was strongly opposed to manned space exploration. In Kennedy's January 1961 State of the Union address, he had suggested international cooperation in space. Khrushchev declined, as the Soviets did not wish to reveal the status of their rocketry and space capabilities. Kennedy proposing a program to land men on the Moon to Congress in May 1961. Johnson and Sam Rayburn are seated behind him. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind, or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Full text. No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. We choose to go to the Moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Full text. On November 21, 1962, in a cabinet meeting with NASA Administrator Webb and other officials, Kennedy explained that the moonshot was important for reasons of international prestige, and that the expense was justified. In a September 1963 speech before the United Nations, Kennedy urged cooperation between the Soviets and Americans in space, specifically recommending that Apollo be switched to a joint expedition to the Moon. On July 20, 1969, almost 6 years after Kennedy's death, Apollo 11 landed the first manned spacecraft on the Moon. Assassination. The Kennedys and the Connellys in the presidential limousine moments before the assassination in Dallas. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, November 22, 1963, while on a political trip to Texas to smooth over frictions in the Democratic Party between liberals Ralph Yarborough and Don Yarborough, no relation, and conservative John Connally. Kennedy was taken to Parkland Hospital for emergency medical treatment, but pronounced dead at 1:00 p.m. Only 46. President Kennedy died younger than any other U.S. president to date. Lee Harvey Oswald, an order filler at the Texas School Book Depository from which the shots were suspected to have been fired, was arrested for the murder of police officer J.D. Tippit, and was charged subsequently with Kennedy's assassination. He denied shooting anyone, claiming he was a patsy, and was killed by Jack Ruby on November 24. Before he could be prosecuted, Ruby was arrested and convicted for the murder of Oswald. Ruby successfully appealed his conviction and death sentence but became ill and died of cancer on January 3, 1967, while the date for his new trial was being set. President Johnson created the Warren Commission, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren, to investigate the assassination, which concluded that Oswald acted alone in killing Kennedy, and that Oswald was not part of any conspiracy. Funeral. A requiem mass was held for Kennedy at the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle on November 25, 1963. Afterwards, Kennedy was interred in a small plot in Arlington National Cemetery. Over a period of 3 years, an estimated 16 million people visited his grave. On March 14, 1967, Kennedy's remains were moved to a permanent burial plot and memorial at the cemetery. The funeral was officiated by Father John J. Kavanaugh. It was from this memorial that the graves of both Robert and Ted Kennedy were modeled. The honor guard at Kennedy's graveside was the 37th Cadet Class of the Irish Army. Kennedy was greatly impressed by the Irish cadets on his last official visit to Ireland, so much so that Jackie Kennedy requested the Irish Army to be the honor guard at her husband's funeral. Kennedy's wife Jacqueline, and their 2 deceased minor children, were later buried with him. His brother, Robert, was buried nearby in June 1968. In August 2009, his brother, Ted, was also buried near his 2 brothers. John F. Kennedy's grave is lit with an eternal flame. Kennedy and William Howard Taft are the only 2 U.S. presidents buried at Arlington. Administration, Cabinet, and Judicial Appointments 1961 to 1963. Judicial appointments. Supreme Court. Other courts. In addition to his 2 Supreme Court appointments, Kennedy appointed 21 judges to the United States Courts of Appeals, and 102 judges to the United States District Courts. Personal life, family, and reputation. Kennedy met his future wife, Jacqueline Lee (Jackie) Bouvier, when he was a congressman. Charles L. Bartlett, a journalist, introduced the pair at a dinner party. The Kennedy family is one of the most established political families in the United States, having produced a president, 3 senators, and multiple other representatives, both on the federal and state level. Family patriarch, Joe Kennedy, was a prominent American businessman and political figure, serving in multiple roles, including ambassador to the United Kingdom, from 1938 to 1940. In October 1951, during his 3rd term as Massachusetts' 11th District Congressman, the then 34-year-old Kennedy embarked on a 7-week trip to India, Japan, Vietnam, and Israel with his then 25-year-old brother Bobby, who had just graduated from law school 4 months earlier, and his then 27-year-old sister Pat. Because they were several years apart in age, the brothers had previously seen little of each other. This 25,000-mile trip was the first extended time they had spent together and resulted in their becoming best friends. Bobby was campaign manager for Kennedy's successful 1952 Senate campaign and later, his successful 1960 presidential campaign. The 2 brothers worked closely together from 1957 to 1959 on the Senate's Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor and Management field, when Robert was its chief counsel. During Kennedy's presidency, Robert served in his cabinet as Attorney General and was his closest advisor. Kennedy was a life member of the National Rifle Association. Children. Caroline Bouvier Kennedy was born in 1957 and is the only surviving member of JFK's immediate family. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., nicknamed John by the press as a child, was born in late November 1960, 17 days after his father was elected. John Jr., a graduate of Brown University, died in 1999 when the small plane he was piloting crashed en route to Martha's Vineyard. Popular image. The Kennedy brothers. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, and President John F. Kennedy in 1963. Kennedy and his wife were younger in comparison to the presidents and first ladies who preceded them, and both were popular in the media culture in ways more common to pop singers and movie stars than politicians, influencing fashion trends and becoming the subjects of numerous photo spreads in popular magazines. Although Eisenhower had allowed presidential press conferences to be filmed for television, Kennedy was the first president to ask for them to be broadcast live and made good use of the medium. Mrs. Kennedy brought new art and furniture to the White House and directed its restoration. They invited a range of artists, writers and intellectuals to rounds of White House dinners, raising the profile of the arts in America. On the White House lawn, the Kennedys established a swimming pool and tree house, while Caroline attended a preschool along with 10 other children inside the home. The president was closely tied to popular culture, emphasized by songs such as "Twisting at the White House," Von Meter's first family comedy album, which parodied the president, the first lady, their family, and the administration, sold about 4 million copies. On May 19, 1962, Marilyn Monroe sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" at a large party in Madison Square Garden, celebrating Kennedy's upcoming 45th birthday. Camelot era. The term Camelot came to be used retrospectively as iconic of the Kennedy administration and the charisma of him and his family. The term was first publicly used by his wife in a post-assassination Life magazine interview with Theodore H. White, in which she revealed his affection for the contemporary Broadway musical of the same name, particularly the closing lines of the title song, "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment that was known as Camelot." Health. In 2002, Robert Dallek wrote an extensive history of Kennedy's health. Dallek was able to consult a collection of Kennedy-associated papers from the years 1955, 1963, including X-rays and prescription records from the files of White House physician Dr. Janet Travell. According to Travell's records, during his presidential years, Kennedy suffered from high fevers, stomach, colon, prostate issues, abscesses, high cholesterol, and adrenal problems. Travell kept a medicine administration record, cataloging Kennedy's medications, injected and ingested corticosteroids for his adrenal insufficiency, procaine shots and ultrasound treatments and hot packs for his back, Lomotil, Metamucil, Paregoric, phenobarbital, testosterone, and Tracentine to control his diarrhea, abdominal discomfort, and weight loss, penicillin and other antibiotics for his urinary tract infections and an abscess, and Tuinal to help him sleep. Quote, years after Kennedy's death, it was revealed that in September 1947, while Kennedy was 30 and in his first term in Congress, he was diagnosed by Sir Daniel Davis at the London Clinic with Addison's disease, a rare endocrine disorder. In 1966, Travell revealed that Kennedy also had hypothyroidism. The presence of two endocrine diseases raises the possibility that Kennedy had autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome type 2, APS2. Kennedy also suffered from chronic and severe back pain, for which he had surgery and was written up in the American Medical Association's archives of surgery. Kennedy's condition may have had diplomatic repercussions, as he appears to have been taking a combination of drugs to treat severe back pain during the 1961 Vienna summit with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The combination included hormones, animal organ cells, steroids, vitamins, enzymes, and amphetamines, and possible potential side effects included hyperactivity, hypertension, impaired judgment, nervousness, and mood swings. There were disagreements among his doctors, into late 1961, over the proper balance of medication and exercise, with the president preferring the former as he was short on time and desired immediate relief. Personal tragedies. Kennedy experienced many personal, family tragedies. His oldest sibling, Joe Jr., was killed in action in 1944 at age 29 over the English Channel during a first attack execution of Operation Aphrodite during World War II. A son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, died 2 days after birth in August 1963. Affairs and extramarital relationships. As a young single man in the 1940s, Kennedy had affairs with Danish journalist Inge Arvad. The extent of a relationship with Monroe is not fully known, although it has been reported that they spent a weekend together in March 1962 while Kennedy was staying at Bing Crosby's house. Kennedy inspired affection and loyalty from the members of his team and his supporters. Ancestry. The Kennedy family came originally from Dunganstown, County Wexford, Ireland. Their son Patrick Joseph P.J. Kennedy was Kennedy's paternal grandfather and father of Joseph Kennedy. Historical evaluations and legacy. Television became the primary source by which people were kept informed of events surrounding John F. Kennedy's assassination. In fact, television started to come of age before the assassination. On September 2, 1963, Kennedy helped inaugurate network television's first half-hour nightly evening newscast according to an interview with CBS Evening News anchor Walter Cronkite. Newspapers were kept as souvenirs rather than sources of updated information. In this sense, his assassination was the first major TV news event of its kind. TV coverage united the nation, interpreting what went on, and creating memories of this space and time. All three major U.S. television networks suspended their regular schedules and switched to all news coverage from November 22 through November 26, 1963, being on the air for 70 hours, making it the longest uninterrupted news event on American TV until 9/11. Kennedy's state funeral procession and the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald were broadcast live in America and in other places around the world. The state funeral was the first of three in a span of 12 months. The other two were for General Douglas MacArthur and President Herbert Clark Hoover. All three have two things in common. The commanding general of the military district of Washington during those funerals was Army Major General Philip C. Willey, and the riderless horse was Black Jack, who also served in that role during Lyndon B. Johnson's funeral. The assassination had an effect on many people, not only in the U.S., but around the world. Many vividly remember where they were when first learning of the news that Kennedy was assassinated, as with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, before it, and the September 11 attacks after it. UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson said of the assassination, "All of us will bear the grief of his death until the day of ours." Many people have also spoken of the shocking news, compounded by the pall of uncertainty about the identity of the assassin, the possible instigators, and the causes of the killing, as an end to innocence. And in retrospect it has been coalesced with other changes of the tumultuous decade of the 1960s, especially the Vietnam War. The U.S. Special Forces had a special bond with Kennedy. It was President Kennedy who was responsible for the rebuilding of the Special Forces and giving us back our Green Beret, said Forrest Lindley, a writer for the U.S. military newspaper Stars and Stripes who served with Special Forces in Vietnam. Kennedy was the first of 6 presidents to have served in the U.S. Navy. Ultimately, the death of President Kennedy, and the ensuing confusion surrounding the facts of his assassination, are of political and historical importance insofar as they marked a turning point and decline in the faith of the American people in the political establishment, a point made by commentators from Gore Vidal to Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., and implied by Oliver Stone in several of his films, such as his landmark 1991 JFK. Although President Kennedy opposed segregation, and had shown support for the civil rights of African Americans, he believed originally in a more measured approach to legislation given the political realities he faced in Congress, especially with the Southern conservatives. President Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor, took up the mantle and pushed the landmark Civil Rights Act through a bitterly divided Congress by invoking the slain president's memory. The dedication of a new forever stamp to honor what would be President John F. Kennedy's 100th birthday. Kennedy's continuation of Presidents Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower's policies of giving economic and military aid to South Vietnam left the door open for President Johnson's escalation of the conflict, suggest that he was ready to end the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War contributed greatly to a decade of national difficulties, amid violent disappointment on the political landscape. Many of Kennedy's speeches, especially his inaugural address, are considered iconic, and despite his relatively short term in office, and the lack of major legislative changes coming to fruition during his term, Americans regularly vote him as one of the best presidents, in the same league as Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Some excerpts of Kennedy's inaugural address are engraved on a plaque at his grave at Arlington. He was posthumously awarded the Passementeris Award, Latin, Peace on Earth. It was named after a 1963 encyclical letter by Pope John XXIII that calls upon all people of goodwill to secure peace among all nations. Kennedy is the only president to have predeceased both his mother and father. He is also the only president to have predeceased a grandparent. His maternal grandmother, Mary Josephine (Josie) Hannon, died in August 1964, 9 months after his assassination. Throughout the English-speaking world, the given name Kennedy has sometimes been used in honor of President Kennedy, as well as his brother Robert. Eponyms: John F. Kennedy International Airport, American Airport, renamed from Idlewild in December 1963, in New York City, nation's busiest international gateway. John F. Kennedy Memorial Airport, American Airport in Ashland County, Wisconsin, near the city of Ashland. John F. Kennedy Memorial Bridge, American 7-lane transportation hub across Ohio River, completed in late 1963. The bridge links Kentucky and Indiana. John F. Kennedy School of Government, American institution, renamed from Harvard Graduate School of Public Administration in 1966. John F. Kennedy Space Center, U.S. government installation that manages and operates America's astronaut launch facilities in Titusville, near Cocoa Beach, FL. John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, trains United States Army personnel for the United States Army Special Operations Command and Army Special Operation Forces at Fort Bragg outside Fayetteville, NC. John F. Kennedy University, American private educational institution founded in California in 1964. Locations in Pleasant Hill, Campbell, Berkeley, and Santa Cruz. USS John F. Kennedy, CV-67, U.S. Navy aircraft carrier ordered in April 1964. Launched May 1967. Decommissioned August 2007. Nicknamed Big John. USS John F. Kennedy, CVN-79, U.S. Navy aircraft carrier that began construction in 2011, and is scheduled to be placed in commission in 2020. Memorials. In currency. Coat of arms. In 1961, Kennedy was presented with a grant of arms for all the descendants of Patrick Kennedy from the Chief Herald of Ireland. The design of the arms strongly alludes to symbols in the coats of arms of the O'Kennedys of Ormond and the Fitzgeralds of Desmond, from whom the family is believed to be descended. The crest is an armored hand holding 4 arrows between 2 olive branches, elements taken from the coat of arms of the United States of America and also symbolic of Kennedy and his brothers. Kennedy received a signet ring engraved with his arms for his 44th birthday as a gift from his wife, and the arms were incorporated into the seal of the USS John F. Kennedy. Following his assassination, Kennedy was honored by the Canadian government, which named Mount Kennedy for him. His brother, Robert Kennedy, climbed it in 1965 to plant a banner of the arms at the summit. Media. Kennedy's message to Turkish President Kemal Gürsel and the Turkish people on the anniversary of the death of Kemal Ataturk, November 10, 1963. Accompanying text. For Hearst newspapers. The assignment kept Kennedy's name in the public eye and exposed congressional career. Because his eldest brother had been the family's political standard-bearer, and had been tapped by his father to seek the presidency, his death in 1944 changed that course and the task now fell to the younger Kennedy. U.S. House of Representatives. At the urging of Kennedy's father, U.S. Representative James Michael Curley vacated his seat in the strongly Democratic 11th Congressional District in Massachusetts to become mayor of Boston in 1946. Kennedy ran for the seat, beating his Republican opponent by a large margin in November 1946. He served as a congressman for 6 years. U.S. Senate. Kennedy nominating Adlai Stevenson for the presidential nomination at the 1952 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. After serving 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, Kennedy decided to run for a seat in the U.S. Senate representing Massachusetts against incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. His mother and sisters held Kennedy teas throughout the state, and his younger brother Robert managed his campaign. In the presidential election, General Dwight D. Eisenhower carried Massachusetts by a margin of 208,000 votes, but Kennedy defeated Lodge by 70,000 votes for the Senate seat. Kennedy underwent several spinal operations over the next 2 years, often absent from the Senate. He was at times critically ill and received Catholic last rites. During his convalescence in 1956, he published Profiles in Courage, a book about U.S. senators who risked their careers for their personal beliefs, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1957. At the 1956 Democratic National Convention, presidential nominee Adlai Stevenson let the convention select the vice presidential nominee. Kennedy finished second in the balloting, losing to Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee but receiving national exposure as a result. One of the matters demanding Kennedy's attention in the Senate was President Eisenhower's bill for the Civil Rights Act of 1957. In 1958, Kennedy was re-elected to a second term in the Senate, defeating his Republican opponent, Boston lawyer Vincent J. Celeste, by a wide margin of 874. Survivors of the SS Athenia before flying back to the U.S. from Foynes, Ireland, to Port Washington, New York on his first transatlantic flight. As an upperclassman at Harvard, Kennedy became a more serious student and developed an interest in political philosophy. In his junior year, he made the Dean's List. U.S. Navy Reserve. Kennedy attempted to enter the Army's officer candidate school in 1940, but was medically disqualified for his chronic lower back problems. On September 24, 1941, after exercising for months to strengthen his back, and with the help of the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, former naval attaché to Joseph Kennedy, he joined the United States Naval Reserve, U.S. Navy Reserve since 2005. He was commissioned an ensign on October 26, 1941. In January 1942, Kennedy was assigned to the Oney Field Office at Headquarters, 6th Naval District, in Charleston, South Carolina. His first command was PT-101 from December 7, 1942, until February 23, 1943. PT-109 and PT-59. In April 1943, he was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron 2. On September 1, 1943, Kennedy returned to duty and took command of a PT boat converted into a gunboat, the PT-59. Kennedy was in Chelsea Naval Hospital from May to December 1944. On August 12, 1944, his older brother, Joe Jr., a Navy pilot, was killed after volunteering for a special and hazardous air mission when his explosive-laden plane exploded over the English Channel. On March 1, 1945, Kennedy was retired from the Navy Reserve on physical disability and honorably discharged with the full rank of lieutenant. Military awards. Kennedy's military decorations and awards include the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, Purple Heart Medal, American Defense Service Medal, American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 3.3.16 Bronze Stars, and the World War II Victory Medal. Post-naval service. In April 1945, Kennedy's father, who was a friend of William Randolph Hearst, arranged a position for his son as a special correspondent. John Fitzgerald Jack Kennedy, commonly referred to by his initials JFK, was an American politician who served as the 35th President of the United States from January 1961 until his assassination in November 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the establishment of the Peace Corps, developments in the space race, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Trade Expansion Act to lower tariffs, and the Civil Rights Movement all took place during his presidency. Kennedy was a member of the Democratic Party, and his New Frontier domestic program was largely enacted as a memorial to him after his death. Kennedy also established the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1963. Kennedy's time in office was marked by high tensions with communist states. He increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam by a factor of 18 over President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In Cuba, a failed attempt was made at the Bay of Pigs to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro in April 1961. He subsequently rejected plans by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to orchestrate false flag attacks on American soil in order to gain public approval for a war against Cuba. In October 1962, it was discovered Soviet ballistic missiles had been deployed in Cuba. The resulting period of unease, termed the Cuban Missile Crisis, is seen by many historians as the closest the human race has ever come to nuclear war between nuclear-armed belligerents. After military service in the United States Naval Reserve in World War II, Kennedy represented Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1947 to 1953. He was elected subsequently to the U.S. Senate and served as the junior senator for Massachusetts from 1953 until 1960. Kennedy defeated Vice President and Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon in the 1960 U.S. presidential election. At age 43, he became the youngest elected president and the second youngest president, after Theodore Roosevelt, who was 42 when he became president after the assassination of William McKinley. Kennedy was also the first person born in the 20th century to serve as president. To date, Kennedy has been the only Roman Catholic president and the only president to have won a Pulitzer Prize for his biography, Profiles in Courage. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested that afternoon and determined to have fired the shots that hit the president from a sixth-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby fatally shot Oswald 2 days later in a jail corridor. Then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson succeeded Kennedy after he died in the hospital. The FBI and the Warren Commission officially concluded that Oswald was the lone assassin, but its report was sharply criticized. The United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, agreed that Oswald fired the shots that killed the president, but also concluded that Kennedy was likely assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. The majority of Americans alive at the time of the assassination, and continuing through 2013, believed that there was a conspiracy and that Oswald was not the only shooter. Since the 1960s, information concerning Kennedy's private life has come to light, including his health problems and allegations of infidelity. Kennedy continues to rank highly in historians' polls of U.S. presidents and with a general public. His average approval rating of 70% is the highest of any president in Gallup's history of systematically measuring job approval. Early life and education. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, on May 29, 1917. Kennedy had an elder brother, Joseph Jr., and 7 younger siblings: Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Ted. Kennedy lived in Brookline for 10 years and attended the Edward Devotion School, the Noble and Greenough Lower School, and the Dexter School through 4th grade. In 1927, the Kennedy family moved to a stately 20-room, Georgian-style mansion at 5040 Independence Avenue, across the street from Wave Hill, in the Hudson Hill neighborhood of Riverdale, Bronx, New York City. He attended the lower campus of Riverdale Country School, a private school for boys, from 5th to 7th grade. 2 years later, the family moved to 294 Penfield Road in the New York City suburb of Bronxville, New York, where Kennedy was a member of Boy Scout Troop 2. The Kennedy family at Hyannisport, Massachusetts. In 1931, with jacket top left and white shirt, Ted was born the following year. In September 1931, Kennedy attended Choate, a boarding school in Wallingford, Connecticut, for 9th through 12th grade. His older brother had already been at Choate for 2 years and was a football player and leading student. He spent his first years at Choate in his older brother's shadow, and compensated for this with rebellious behavior which attracted a coterie. Their most notorious stunt was to explode a toilet seat with a powerful firecracker. In the ensuing chapel assembly, the strict headmaster, George John, brandished the toilet seat and spoke of certain muckers who would spit in our sea. The defiant Kennedy took the cue and named his group the Muckers Club, which included roommate and friend Kirk Lemoyne Billings. During his Choate years, Kennedy was beset by health problems that culminated with his emergency hospitalization at New Haven Hospital in 1934, where doctors thought he might have had leukemia. In September 1935, he made his first trip abroad with his parents and his sister Kathleen to London, intending to study under Harold Laski at the London School of Economics, LSE, as his older brother had done. Ill health forced his return to America in October of that year, when he enrolled late and spent 6 weeks at Princeton University. In 1935, Kennedy briefly attended Princeton University, but had to leave after 2 months due to a gastrointestinal illness. Later, in September 1936, Kennedy enrolled at Harvard College, and his application essay stated, "The reasons that I have for wishing to go to Harvard are several. I feel that Harvard can give me a better background and a better liberal education than any other university. I have always wanted to go there, as I have felt that it is not just another college, but is a university with something definite to offer. Then too, I would like to go to the same college as my father. To be a Harvard man is an enviable distinction, and one that I sincerely hope I shall attain." Quote. In 1939, Kennedy toured Europe, the Soviet Union, the Balkans, and the Middle East in preparation for his Harvard senior honors thesis. He then went to Czechoslovakia and Germany before returning to London on September 1, 1939, the day that Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, the family was in the House of Commons for speeches endorsing the United Kingdom's declaration of war on Germany. Kennedy was sent as his father's representative to help with arrangements for American